For a closer look on this, let's bring in Ahmad Wais Wardak. He's a political science professor at the University of Hartford. Welcome to the show. And this topic has so many different angles to it. Let's start with this. The economy there now, where does it stand from where it was prior to the U.S. leaving?
Thank you for having me, Phil. First of all, if we look at the baseline, Afghanistan was not doing very well. It was one of the poorest countries to begin with. Yes, over $4 billion just in foreign aid were flowing to Afghanistan, but those were very concentrated in the capital in Kabul. But the majority of country was suffering from poverty. But just 4 months ago, according to a Gallup survey, Afghans considered themselves suffering for the first time in the 4 decades of war. The economy was labeled as poverty prior to this, but never as suffering. So people are suffering in a nutshell.
When the U.S. left and the Taliban took over and running the country, there was $7 billion that was associated with the central banks that was essentially frozen in the United States. In addition to that, there were a number of NGOs that worked directly in Afghanistan that provided a significant amount of humanitarian assistance, right, from education to food to healthcare. And they, of course, have stopped going there as far as we know. What should the solution be today going forward in getting things to be more normalized? And while you may or may not support the government there, nobody wants to see suffering on the ground. What can be done?
Exactly. See, like you mentioned, the freezing of the central bank's assets. This actually cuts directly from the food table of the ordinary people of Afghans. This actually not only freezes the assets, but also freezes the movement of other assets. It also affects the inflation. It actually kills the private sector, the banking system in Afghanistan, their shortage of cash, the hard cash doesn't exist. The Afghan businessmen cannot trade, and the foreign investments or people living outside, they cannot send money to their relatives and loved ones. So basically, the state of the economy is in stagnation, and continuing of this situation will deteriorate the situation.
Right. I'm sorry to interrupt, but I want to make sure we get this point across, because we're having you on to provide a solution on how to make things better. What is your preferred solution to make things better for the people on the ground there in Afghanistan?
The preferred solution, economic sanction, is not the solution. The central assets, the central bank's asset should be released, and the Afghan private sector should be able to actually have access to the central bank's assets. So that's the basic solution. That's the basic solution. And the sanctions on the Taliban, for example, shouldn't translate into sanctions on the entire nation.
Right. Would part of that solution also be having NGOs back in the country, whether it's Western NGOs or Asian NGOs or Chinese NGOs? I mean, these NGOs were a critical part of providing assistance to those in need in that economy well before the U.S. pullout.
Yeah, see, I'm personally a political scientist. I am more into having a strong state for Afghanistan. So NGOs are essential when state institutions don't exist. But first of all, we should save the state, the Afghan state, from collapsing. That should be our priority. The state institutions shouldn't collapse. And yes, of course, where state institutions are not effective in delivery of the public services, then NGOs should help the government. But the first and foremost, we shouldn't collapse the Afghan state per se.
Right. So for the Taliban themselves, they are currently running the country now. What advice would you give to them in order to, I suppose, open up the country back to the potential of getting that economic assistance, or as you say, make sure that the country doesn't collapse?
Exactly. See, the problem is with the Biden administration and the Taliban. They are in a straight competition, and the people are suffering. The Taliban should actually release some of the women's rights, for example. They should actually start having a broad-based government. The administration should be more technical rather than led by religious. So far, the government, the Taliban government, is very much inclusive to their own group. It's not a national government. It doesn't have a national legitimacy. First of all, the Taliban government the Taliban administration should actually claim its internal legitimacy. And without internal legitimacy, external legitimacy cannot be achieved.